recluse in some sense, and for whose claims are rejected or are not respected. So there could be any number of reasons for the failure. But what is true, and in fact tautologically true, which is why I call it a framework rather than a theory, is that if someone starves to death for food, for lack of ability to establish command over food, it must be for one or another reason. There must be one or another way in which that person failed to establish command over food. And I think that that uniting a rights-based analysis with an adequate institutional analysis will, in this way, help us to ask the right questions, not just with respect to food security, but with respect to all the things that matter for human beings to live a minimally decent and adequate life. Food is not the only necessity. It's quite right that human beings do not live by bread alone. There are other physical necessities, material necessities, and there are arguably immaterial necessities for human life, and for human beings to survive and to thrive. And all of those could be the subject of a corresponding kind of extended entitlement analysis, to use Sen's phrase of entitlements, in which we ask the question, and perhaps radicalize the question, why is it that people in a particular place, people perhaps of a particular ethnic group or social group, people who belong to certain occupational categories, classes, are failing to establish command over the material and perhaps immaterial necessities of life. The 50th anniversary of Amnesty International, of course, has been marked in many ways. And one of the ways in which it has been marked, I came to see during some late-night rambling on the web, is that there was a very amusing video which was produced by the UK chapter of Amnesty International, involving amnesty activists, probably some of you know this, knocking on the embassies, on the doors of various embassies and consulates in London to thank the countries in question for keeping Amnesty International in business for the last 50 years. And so, as you can imagine, these are the usual suspects, countries which were deemed to be guilty of violating liberal rights of various kinds, civil rights and political freedoms in particular. And so countries such as North Korea and other such uncontroversial usual suspects very much figured. It's interesting that the video didn't include some of the more controversial countries, such as the United States, on the doorstep. I don't recall if it did, maybe it did. One could also have or on the embassy door, which one could also have knocked. Though I suspect that it would have been pretty hard to get within, get sufficiently close to the U.S. embassy door in London to do that. But this amusing video, which I encourage you to watch if you should seek amusement, does highlight something very interesting, which is that in the case of violations of civil rights, political rights, it's fairly easy to identify the wrongdoer, the rights violator, and that's one reason that the language of rights violation proliferates in this field. The notion that there are violations and that there are violators. But it's much less easy to identify the individual agents or parties that can be ascribed responsibility for such violations in the case of economic and social rights, because the economic and social rights with which we are concerned are the product of complex causal processes which involve multiple agencies, agents of different kinds, individuals, firms, governments, interacting often in very complicated ways over historical time. And it is perhaps therefore not surprising that Professor Wolff chose to focus his analysis on an entire system, or what he described as an entire system, rather than focus attention on particular entities, such as the Coca-Cola Corporation or the United States government, or for that matter, individual persons in this room. Much as it might be tempting to do that, there are severe limitations to such an analysis in understanding why it is that economic and social rights failures take place. And of course, this is one of the reasons that it has been difficult to bring about activism in relation to economic and social rights in the same way that it has been possible to bring about activism in relation to civil and political rights. The complexity of the causal mechanisms makes it hard to know to whose doorstep to go, at whom to point the fingers. That indeed may not be the right way to proceed at all. Nevertheless, I think it is a very useful lens, as I have been arguing. Let me give an example from my own work, which will be, I think, of general relevance to you given today's theme, which makes this apparent. Professor Wolff pointed out that the poverty line being used for the United States by most analysts, which has its origins in the early work of Molly Orshansky, a mid-level official in the Labor Department in the early 1960s, leads to a very, very low poverty line indeed, and one which it's hard to really think of as being adequate for achieving basic necessities in the United States. Now, why is it that the United States, a country which has many achievements to its credit, including putting a human being on the moon and building and safeguarding, if one can use that phrase, a very large number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and many other such things, which are, involve enormous deployment of resources and intelligence, doesn't have a poverty line which can easily pass scrutiny. It has a rough and ready poverty line which has a meaning which is far from apparent and which is widely and rightly questioned. Is it that this is too unimportant a subject to give any attention to? Or is it that it is too expensive to use governmental resources on establishing a transparent and well-defined poverty line? That those resources would rather and better be spent on building another intercontinental ballistic missile? Or is there some other reason that one can give? Is it simply an impossible task? Perhaps it's that any choice would be arbitrary, as I'm often told by some of our neoclassical economist friends. It's all arbitrary anyway, so it hardly matters. That's one very prominent view in the so-called profession. Not entirely easy to know what the reason is that this has been such a low priority for the United States government and its diverse organs. Except, perhaps, that it is useful to have a not very precise and not very well-defined poverty line, because the consequences of having one that is precise and that is well-defined would be perhaps embarrassing. In my own work on global poverty estimates, I found something similar. That the poverty estimates which are most widely used today, the so-called $1 and $2 a day, or now $1.25 and $2.50 a day poverty lines, which are produced by the World Bank, have precisely no justification in terms of a concern for the underlying real requirements of human beings to live a minimally adequate life. There are various twists and turns and gymnastics which are done by the defenders to argue that there is some such justification. But in my view, none of those gymnastics actually work. So the basic problem, both in the US case and in the global case, and I would also argue in the case of India, which is another country whose poverty debate I've been following quite closely, and many other countries as well, is that the poverty line which is used does not have an adequate justification in terms of the real requirements of human beings, if you will, in terms of economic and social rights. one of the things which a rights-based perspective can do, can deliver here, is to help us understand what an appropriate poverty line would be. And this is not a trivial contribution. A rights-based perspective in the area of measurement of poverty, which admittedly is only one small part of the analysis of poverty which needs to be done, and of how to address poverty which needs to be done, would help us precisely overcome the so-called arbitrariness which many mainstream economists claim is our fate in the area of poverty line construction. Angus Deaton, one of the celebrated microeconometricians of the day, a professor at Princeton University, has said very explicitly, for example, that every poverty line is quote-unquote subjective. From this point of view, one could have a poverty line of 10 cents a day, or one could have a poverty line of $50,000 a day. It's no more wrong to establish a poverty line in which the Queen of England is poor but Bill Gates is not, than it is to establish a poverty line in which no one in the United States is poor. These are mere political choices which conform to the particular political exigencies which happen to hold. And the role of the economist is, in the famous words of George Stigler, to be yes men in the halls of political economy. So our responsibility is to find out what the policymakers want and then to deliver that. Recently, the government of India parenthetically has formalized this procedure by accepting the recommendation of a committee which has established the novel procedure of starting with a headcount ratio for the country and deriving a poverty line which sanctifies that headcount ratio, rather than going the other way around. That's an unusually naked formalization of this idea. But I think this is the governing idea by and large. So if one were to have a rights-based perspective, one would have a non-arbitrary basis for establishing a poverty line. I believe that such a rights-based perspective can deliver that. I don't think that it's subject to hopeless amount of subjectivity, as is generally argued. I also think, and I don't want to go into the details now because they can get a little bit technical, but I also think that this procedure, a rights-based procedure, would actually avoid a way to overcome many of the analytical knots which debates on poverty measurement generally get involved in or succumb to. And the main reason for that is that if one has a proper rights-based procedure for determining who should be identified as being poor, that procedure can be employed at any point in space and time consistently, and thereby provide a coherent and consistent way of making comparisons across space and across time, so that the usual so-called index number problems which economists get into and which make it very hard to track how the number of people who are poor is changing over time, or whether there are more poor people in one country rather than another, is overcome. Now, this is quite a lot of specialized discourse that I've been engaging in about a very particular problem involving poverty measurement. But I think that this is just one example of and an important one, of the way in which having a rights-based perspective makes a difference, motivationally and analytically. It's not true that it's just soft-headed moralizing. On the contrary, what's true is that without it, all that one is left with is rank confusion. And if one has a proper anchor, an evaluative anchor, as to what it is that one cares about and why, that makes all the difference in knowing what to do. As a social scientist, or as a so-called policymaker. Professor Wolff, like me, might not like the phrase policymaker, because it's so redolent with top-downism, with the idea that there are people who sit in the vestibule of power who will work out what to do. And the role of programs such as the graduate program in international affairs and Milano's school